There is something that was removed from the record, not by accident, not by the slow erosion of time, but deliberately, carefully, in the way that you remove something when you understand exactly how powerful it is, and you do not want that power distributed freely. For thousands of years, certain traditions encoded a specific way of speaking to yourself. Not affirmations in the modern sense. Not positive thinking in the self-help sense. Something older than both of those. Something that operated on a principle that quantum mechanics would not formally describe until the 20th century, but that ancient practitioners had already mapped in extraordinary detail. They called it by different names in different traditions. The inner command, the sacred utterance, the voice beneath the voice, the frequency of the witness. What they all pointed to was the same thing, a specific quality of inner speech that does not petition reality from the outside, that does not beg or hope or wish, a quality of inner speech that speaks from inside the field itself, as the field itself, and in doing so, bends the structure of what is possible around the speaker. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry, dressed up as instruction. What I am about to show you has a precise quantum mechanical description, a precise neurological signature, and a precise lineage in ancient wisdom traditions that stretches back further than most people's understanding of history goes. And it was buried. Not lost. Buried. There is a difference between something that disappears and something that is placed beneath the surface deliberately, in a location where most people will not think to look. What was done to this knowledge was the second thing. The texts that encoded it were selectively translated. The traditions that practiced it were systematically dismantled. What remained on the surface, what was left visible, was a version of the teaching so stripped of its operative mechanism that it became decorative, inspirational perhaps, functionally inert. What you have been given in its place is a surface version of a very deep truth. And today we go beneath the surface. We are going to do this in layers, the way you excavate anything of real value. Not ripping the surface off all at once, because what lies beneath each layer requires the previous layer to make sense of. We will start with what you think you know about self-talk, about the voice inside your head, about the words you speak in silence. We will establish that surface understanding clearly. And then we will dismantle it, not to leave you with nothing, but because what is beneath it is so much more substantial, so much more real, so much more useful, that the surface version has to come down for the depth to become visible. Let me begin with what most people believe. Most people believe that self-talk is psychological, that the words you speak inside your head influence your mood, your confidence, your motivation, and through those things your behavior, and through your behavior, your outcomes. This is the standard model. This is what you find in every psychology textbook, every self-help framework, every productivity manual. Speak kindly to yourself and you will feel better. Feel better and you will perform better. Perform better and your life will improve. This is not wrong. It is just the surface layer of something with enormous depth beneath it. This surface version treats self-talk as a psychological tool, a way of managing your internal state so that your external actions become more effective. In this model, the words you speak to yourself are inputs into a system. That system is your mind. Your mind then produces outputs, which are behaviors, and those behaviors interact with a fixed external reality to produce results. Notice what this model assumes. It assumes that external reality is fixed. It assumes that the world out there is a given, a solid, settled, unchanging backdrop against which your psychological states and behaviors play out. It assumes that self-talk works by changing you, and you then go out and navigate a reality that was already there, waiting, unchanged by your inner speech. This is the assumption we are going to peel back today, because quantum mechanics found something beneath the surface of matter that should have shattered this assumption completely. It found it clearly, rigorously, repeatably. It published the findings. The experiments are not disputed, and yet the implications, the full implications of what was found, have not made it into the popular understanding of self-talk, of consciousness, of reality, they remain buried beneath the surface version of the story, waiting for someone to show you the layer underneath. Here is what quantum mechanics found. At the subatomic level, particles do not have fixed properties until they are observed. This is not a philosophical position. This is an experimental result. The electron does not have a definite position, a definite momentum, a definite spin, until a measurement is made. Before observation, it exists in what physics calls superposition, a simultaneous distribution of all the possible states it could be in. The act of observation, the act of measurement, collapses that distribution into a single definite outcome. The observer does not discover what was already there. The observer participates in determining what becomes real. This is the observer effect, and it is not a quirk at the edges of physics. It is a foundational principle of the structure of reality at its most fundamental level. The world at its base layer is not a collection of fixed things. It is a field of potential, and what becomes actual within that field is influenced by the act of observation. Now, most people stop at the surface version of this finding. They hear the observer effect and they think, interesting, but that is just subatomic stuff. That does not apply to the macro world I live in. The coffee cup on my desk does not dissolve into a probability wave when I stop looking at it. And that is true, as far as it goes. The decoherence that occurs at larger scales of matter does make the quantum effects less visible at the level of everyday objects. But here is what most people miss. Here is the layer beneath that surface objection. The macro world you live in is built from the subatomic world. Every atom in your body, in the coffee cup, in the desk, in the room, in the city, in the planet, is operating according to quantum principles. The classical, solid-seeming world you navigate is an emergent property of a quantum substrate that is not solid, not fixed, not independent of observation. The solidity is real at the scale you operate at, but it is not the deepest layer of what is there. And more importantly, there is one domain where the quantum principles apply directly, without decoherence, without the scale problem. There is one domain where you're operating at the level of quantum fields, where the observer effect is not a distant subatomic curiosity, but an immediate operative reality. That domain is consciousness itself. Your awareness is not a classical system. Your awareness does not operate like a coffee cup. The neural processes that underlie conscious experience involve quantum scale events. The binding problem in neuroscience, the question of how billions of separate neural signals become unified into a single coherent experience, does not have a satisfying classical answer. Several serious physicists and neuroscientists, including figures like Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, have proposed that quantum coherence in microtubules within neurons may be part of the mechanism. This remains debated, but what is not debated is the experimental finding itself. Consciousness is correlated with the collapse of quantum possibility into experienced reality. The observer and the observed are not as separate as the surface model assumes, which means that what you speak inside your awareness, the quality, the frequency, the structure of your inner speech, is not just a psychological input into a system that then goes out and navigates a fixed reality. It is a participation in the ongoing determination of what becomes real. This is the layer beneath the surface. This is what they stopped translating. Because if this is true, if the inner speech of a conscious observer participates in the structuring of experienced reality, then the question of how to speak to yourself is not a question of psychological hygiene. It is a question of operative frequency. It is a question of what layer of reality your inner voice is speaking from and speaking to. And this is precisely what the ancient traditions encoded. If this is landing for you, if you can feel the depth of what we are uncovering here, take a moment to like this video and subscribe so we can keep going deeper together. Let us go beneath the surface of history for a moment, because this is where the burial happened, and understanding how it happened helps you understand what was buried and why. There are at least 4 distinct ancient traditions that encoded a sophisticated understanding of inner speech as an operative force in reality, not a metaphorical force, not an inspirational force, an operative force with specific techniques, specific qualities, specific frequencies that were understood to produce specific effects in the structure of experienced reality. The first tradition is the Vedic tradition of ancient India. In the Vedas and the Upanishads, the concept of vak, which translates roughly as speech or the word, is not simply communication. Vak is described as a cosmic principle, a creative force that participates in the structure of reality itself. There are 4 levels of vak described in the Vedic texts. Para, the transcendent level, beyond sound, beyond form, the level of pure potential. Pashyanti, the level where speech first becomes differentiated, where intention takes form before words exist. Madhyama, the subtle middle level, where thought and inner speech arise in the mind. And Vaikari, the gross level, the spoken, audible word. What the Vedic tradition understood and encoded in extraordinary technical detail is that the operative power of speech does not reside at the level of Vaikari, the audible spoken word. It does not even reside primarily at the level of Madhyama, ordinary inner thought. The operative power resides at the level of Pashyanti, the subtle level where intention first differentiates from the field of pure potential. And the practice they developed was a way of speaking that originated from that deeper level, that carried the frequency of that deeper level, even when expressed as ordinary inner speech. This is not the same as affirmations. Affirmations operate at the level of Madhyama, ordinary thought. The Vedic practice was something different. It was a way of dropping beneath ordinary thought to the level where speech arises from the field itself and speaking from there. The second tradition is the Hermetic tradition of ancient Egypt and Greece, preserved in the Corpus Hermeticum and related texts. The Hermetic principle of the Logos, the word, the inner creative utterance, describes a similar understanding. The Logos is not a word you speak. It is a word that speaks through you when you are aligned with the deeper structure of reality. The Hermetic texts describe this as speaking with authority, not the authority of ego, not the authority of personal will, but the authority of one who has recognized their nature as an expression of the creative intelligence that underlies all things. From that recognition, inner speech carries a different quality. It does not request. It does not hope. It declares from inside the field. The third tradition is the Kabbalistic tradition of ancient Jewish mysticism, which encodes in the concept of the golem and the practice of working with the divine names, an understanding that certain forms of speech, spoken from a specific inner state with a specific quality of intention, carry creative force in reality. The Kabbalistic tradition was extraordinarily precise about this. It was not the words themselves that carried the power. It was the inner state from which they were spoken, the level of consciousness from which they originated. The fourth tradition is the Taoist tradition of ancient China, which in the concept of Wu Wei, effortless action, and in the practices associated with inner alchemy, describes a quality of inner speech that does not push against reality, but aligns with the Tao, the underlying current of what is, and in that alignment finds that reality moves to meet it. The Taoist inner speech practices were not about forcing outcomes. They were about speaking from the level of the Tao itself, which is the level from which all outcomes arise. 4 traditions, 4 different cultures, 4 different languages, 4 different historical periods, all encoding the same fundamental discovery. That inner speech has an operative level that most people never reach because most people speak from the surface of themselves to a surface they believe is fixed. And the traditions that knew how to speak from the depth to a depth that is responsive were systematically dismantled. The dismantling happened in different ways in different traditions. In the Vedic tradition, the operative practices were restricted to initiates, and eventually the technical understanding was lost even within the tradition itself, leaving only the surface forms, the mantras without the operative mechanism, the affirmations without the frequency. In the Hermetic tradition, the texts were suppressed, selectively preserved, and the operative understanding was buried beneath layers of allegory that most readers never penetrated. In the Kabbalistic tradition, the operative practices were restricted so severely that they became effectively inaccessible, preserved only in fragments that required enormous scholarly excavation to recover. In the Taoist tradition, the inner alchemy practices were externalized, turned into physical practices, and the inner speech component was largely lost. What remained on the surface in each case was a version of the teaching that was real enough to feel meaningful, but stripped of its operative mechanism. Inspirational, beautiful, functionally incomplete. And then in the modern era, what replaced these traditions in the popular imagination was positive thinking, affirmations, the law of attraction as commonly taught, which took the surface residue of these ancient teachings and stripped it even further, removing the quantum mechanical understanding, removing the precise inner state requirement, and presenting the whole thing as a simple formula. Think positive thoughts, and positive things will happen. Speak abundance affirmations, and abundance will manifest. This is not wrong in the way that a lie is wrong. It is wrong in the way that a map drawn only of the surface is wrong when you are trying to navigate the underground. The surface map is real. It just does not show you where the depth is or how to reach it. But there is a layer beneath that. And now we go there. Let me tell you about a woman named Siona. Siona lived in a city built on ruins, not metaphorically, literally. The city she lived in had been built on top of 3 previous cities, each one constructed on the foundations of the one before it. The archaeologists knew this. The historians knew this. But the people who lived in the city, who walked its streets and worked in its buildings, and raised their children in its apartments, did not think about it. To them, the city was simply the city. Solid. Present. The only layer they needed to know. Siona was a translator. She worked for a university, translating ancient texts from languages that almost no one else could read. And one day she was given a manuscript that had been sitting in the university's archive for 200 years untranslated. Not because no one had been able to translate it, because the previous translator, a scholar who had worked on it briefly in the 19th century, had written a single note in the margin of the first page and then stopped. The note said, "This should not be widely known." Siona did not stop. She translated the manuscript over the course of 3 years, working slowly because the text was not just linguistically complex, it was structurally complex. It was written in layers. The surface layer was a philosophical text about the nature of thought. The layer beneath that was a technical manual for a specific inner practice. The layer beneath that was a precise description of what the practice did to the structure of experienced reality. What the text described, in the technical language of a tradition that no longer existed in recognizable form, was this: that the ordinary inner voice, the voice most people speak to themselves in, operates at the level of the surface of the self. It speaks from the part of you that believes it is separate from reality, that believes reality is out there and you are in here, and that the best you can do is manage your internal state well enough to navigate what is fixed and external. From this level, inner speech is a commentary on reality. It describes what is, it reacts to what is, it hopes for what might be, but it does not participate in what becomes. The text called this the voice of the surface dweller. Beneath it, the text described a different quality of inner speech. A quality that arises when the speaker has, through a specific practice, dropped beneath the sense of separation from reality and made contact with what the text called the generative layer, the layer where experience is not yet fixed, the layer that quantum mechanics would later describe as the field of superposition, where all possibilities exist before one is selected. From this layer, inner speech does not comment on reality. It does not react to reality. It does not hope or wish or petition. It speaks as the field itself. It declares from inside the generative process. And in doing so, it participates in determining which possibility becomes actual. The text called this the voice of the depth. And then the text said something that stopped Sayona completely. Something she read 3 times before she believed she was translating it correctly. It said, "The difference between these two voices is not what they say. It is where they speak from. You can speak identical words from the surface and from the depth, and they will produce entirely different effects in the structure of reality. This is why the teaching cannot be transmitted through words alone. The words are the surface. The frequency is the depth, and the frequency is what does the work." Sayona sat with that for a long time, because she understood, as a translator, exactly what it meant. She had spent her career working with texts where the surface meaning and the depth meaning were entirely different things, where the words on the page were a container for something that the words themselves could not contain, where the real transmission was happening in the space between the words, in the quality of the original speaker's state when they spoke, in the frequency that the text was trying to point toward, but could not, by its nature as text, actually transmit. The text she was translating was not trying to give her the words to say, it was trying to give her a map to the place to speak from. And the map was precise, extraordinarily precise. It described the inner state in physiological terms, in experiential terms, in terms of what you would notice in your body, in your breathing, in the quality of your awareness when you were speaking from the depth rather than the surface. And Siona, being a translator, understood that the only way to verify a translation is to test it. So she tested it. What she found over the months that followed is what I am going to describe to you now. Not as Siona's experience, but as the operative mechanism itself, which is what she ultimately wrote about in the paper she published 3 years after completing her translation. A paper that was read by almost no one, because it was published in a journal that almost no one reads, in a language that almost no one speaks, about a manuscript that almost no one knows exists, hidden in plain sight. Here is the layer beneath the surface version of self-talk, the ordinary inner voice, the voice most people use when they are trying to do affirmations, trying to practice positive self-talk, trying to use the law of attraction, operates from a specific neurological state, a state that neuroscience can now describe with some precision. It is a state of what researchers call self-referential processing, associated primarily with the default mode network of the brain. This is the network that activates when you are thinking about yourself, planning, worrying, ruminating, rehearsing conversations, imagining futures. It is the network of the narrative self, the self that tells the story of who you are and what you can expect. When you speak affirmations from this state, when you say, "I am abundant," or "I am worthy," or "everything works out for me," from the default mode network, from the narrative self, there is a problem. The narrative self already has a story. And the story is built from evidence, from memory, from pattern recognition, from the accumulated weight of your actual experience. And when you speak a statement that contradicts that story, the narrative self does not simply accept the new statement. It evaluates it against the existing story, and it finds the contradiction. This is why affirmations often feel hollow. This is why people report feeling vaguely dishonest when they say them. This is why the positive psychology research on affirmations shows mixed results, with some studies finding that they actually decrease well-being in people with low self-esteem, because the contradiction between the affirmation and the existing narrative is so stark that it draws attention to the gap rather than bridging it. The surface version of affirmations is trying to change the story by adding new lines to it. But the story is not the level where reality is determined. The story is the surface. And you cannot change what is beneath the surface by painting the surface a different color. But there is a layer beneath that. I want to pause here and ask you something, because this is the moment where the depth becomes personal. Has there ever been a time when you saw through an illusion you had been living inside? When something you always sensed beneath the surface of your own inner voice suddenly became visible and you could not unsee it? Drop it in the comments. What was the hidden layer you discovered beneath the story you had been telling yourself? The ancient traditions and the quantum mechanics both point to the same thing. There is a state of consciousness that is not the default mode network, not the narrative self, not the storytelling, self-referencing, evidence-evaluating surface layer. It is a state that neuroscience describes as occurring during deep meditation, during flow states, during moments of profound presence, during certain kinds of creative absorption. It is associated with a very different pattern of neural activity. The default mode network quiets. The sense of a separate self narrating its own story recedes. And what remains is awareness itself, without the story, without the separation, without the evaluating commentary. In this state, inner speech has a completely different quality, not because the words are different, because the speaker is different, because the level from which the speech arises is different. When you speak from this state, from this depth, you are not adding a new line to the existing story. You are speaking from before the story, from the level where the story has not yet been written, from what quantum mechanics would call the superposition state, where all possibilities exist before one is selected. And from that level, what you speak does not get evaluated against the existing narrative, because you are beneath the level where the narrative operates. It enters the field of potential directly. This is what the ancient traditions called speaking with authority. Not the authority of the ego, not the authority of personal confidence, but the authority of speaking from inside the generative process itself. The authority of the field speaking through you rather than you speaking at the field. And this is the frequency they buried, not the words, the state, the level, the depth from which the speech arises. Because if you do not know that this level exists, you will spend your entire life speaking from the surface, painting the surface with new colors and wondering why the depth does not change. Now I want to show you something about the quantum mechanics of this, because the science here is not decoration, it is the mechanism. In quantum field theory, the vacuum state, what physics calls empty space, is not actually empty. It is a field of virtual particles, of quantum fluctuations, of potential that is constantly arising and subsiding. This is not theoretical. The Casimir effect, an experimentally verified phenomenon, demonstrates that the quantum vacuum exerts real, measurable force. Empty space has structure. Potential has physical reality. What collapses potential into actuality in quantum mechanics is interaction, observation, measurement, the engagement of a system with its environment in a way that forces a definite state to emerge from the superposition of possible states. Consciousness, in the interpretations of quantum mechanics that take the observer seriously, including the Copenhagen interpretation in its strongest form, the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation, and the relational interpretation developed by Carlo Rovelli, is not a passive recorder of what is already fixed. It is an active participant in the collapse from potential to actual. The observer is not outside the system, looking at a reality that was already determined. The observer is inside the system, and the act of observation is part of what determines what becomes real. Now here is the critical point. The quality of the observation matters. In quantum mechanics, different kinds of measurements produce different kinds of collapses. The way you observe a quantum system affects what you find. This is not just a technical point about measurement apparatus. It is a fundamental feature of the relationship between observer and observed. The observer's mode of engagement with the field shapes what the field presents. Translate this into the language of consciousness and inner speech, and what you get is this. The quality of your inner speech, the level from which it arises, the frequency it carries, the state of the observer who is speaking, shapes what the field of potential presents to you as your experienced reality. Speaking from the surface, from the narrative self, from the evaluating, storytelling, evidence-comparing default mode network, produces one kind of observation. It observes from separation. It observes from the assumption that reality is fixed and external. And the field responds to that mode of observation by presenting a reality that appears fixed and external. Speaking from the depth, from the state of awareness without story, from the level where the sense of separation between observer and observed has receded, produces a different kind of observation. It observes from inside the field. It observes as the field. And the field responds to that mode of observation by presenting a reality that is responsive, that is participatory, that bends. This is not a metaphor. This is the operative mechanism. This is what the ancient traditions mapped and what quantum mechanics confirmed. And this is what was buried in the translation. Let me show you what this means practically. Let me show you the difference between surface-level self-talk and depth-level self-talk. Not in terms of the words, but in terms of the inner state, the frequency, the quality of the speaker. Surface-level self-talk sounds like this inside. I want to be abundant. I am trying to feel abundant. I am telling myself I am abundant. I hope this works. I am not sure I believe this, but I am saying it anyway. Notice what is happening in that inner monologue. There is a self who is doing the speaking. There is a reality that is being spoken at. There is a gap between the current state and the desired state. There is evaluation happening. There is hope, which is the frequency of not yet. There is effort, which is the frequency of resistance. The narrative self is fully activated, fully present, fully engaged in the project of trying to change its story by adding new lines to it. Depth-level self-talk does not sound like that. It does not sound like anything initially because it begins not with words, but with a dropping beneath words, a settling beneath the narrative self into the awareness that underlies it. And from that awareness, from that silence beneath the story, something speaks. Not from effort, not from hope, not from the gap between current and desired, from a place that has no gap, from a place that is not trying to become something it is not, from a place that is speaking from inside what is already true at the level of the field, before it has become visible at the level of the surface. From this place, the inner speech does not say, "I want to be abundant." It says, I am the field from which abundance arises, not as a statement about personal identity, as a recognition of what is true at the quantum level. At the level of the field, before collapse, all possibilities are present, including the possibility of abundance, and the observer who speaks from inside that field, from inside that superposition, is not requesting abundance from outside. They are recognizing abundance as already present in the field, and in that recognition, collapsing it from potential into actual. This is the difference between praying to a God outside you and recognizing that you are an expression of the creative intelligence that underlies all things. This is the difference between asking the universe for something and speaking as the universe. This is the difference between surface-level affirmation and depth-level inner command. And now, I want to give you the practice, not a surface practice, the actual practice, the one that the texts encoded, the one that Siona translated, the one that the ancient traditions protected and the modern era buried. There are 3 components to this practice, and I want to be precise about each one because the precision is the point. The ancient traditions were not vague about this. They were extraordinarily specific, and the specificity is what made the practice operative rather than decorative. The first component is the descent. Before you speak anything, you descend beneath the narrative self. This is not a metaphor. It is a specific inner movement that has a specific experiential signature. You know you have made the descent when the evaluating commentary of the narrative self quiets, when the sense of a story being told about you recedes, when what remains is awareness without content, presence without narration, the witness that is prior to the witnessed. How do you make this descent? The ancient traditions used different techniques, but they all converged on the same mechanism. You attend to the source of your awareness rather than the content of your awareness. You turn the light of attention back on itself, back toward the awareness that is doing the attending, rather than forward toward the objects being attended to. In Vedic terms, this is the practice of turning Pashyanti, the subtle level of speech, back toward Para, the transcendent source. In Hermetic terms, it is the practice of the Logos recognizing itself. In quantum terms, it is the observer recognizing that it is the observer, not the observed. Practically, this feels like a softening, a widening, a sense of the background of awareness becoming more vivid than the foreground of content. The thoughts are still there, but they are happening in a larger space, a quieter space, a space that is not identified with any particular thought or story. This is the descent. This is the first component. The second component is the recognition. From the state of the descent, before you speak any specific content, you make a recognition, not an affirmation, not a statement about what you want to be true, a recognition of what is already true at the level of the field. The recognition is this. At the level of the field, before collapse, before the narrative self has selected from the infinite possibilities and called one of them my reality, everything is present, including what you are about to speak. The recognition is that you are not about to request something from outside. You are about to recognize something that is already present in the field, and in the act of recognition, collapse it from potential into actual. This recognition is not a thought you think. It is a quality of the state you are in. It is the difference between speaking from the position of someone who is outside the field, hoping the field will respond, and speaking from the position of someone who is inside the field, who is the field, who is making a declaration from within the generative process itself. The ancient traditions describe this recognition using different language. The Vedic tradition called it the recognition of Brahman, the recognition that the individual awareness is an expression of the universal awareness. The Hermetic tradition called it the recognition of the Logos, the recognition that the inner creative intelligence is an expression of the cosmic creative intelligence. The Kabbalistic tradition called it Devakut, cleaving to the divine, the recognition that the individual is not separate from the creative source. The Taoist tradition called it alignment with the Tao, the recognition that the individual is not separate from the underlying current of what is. Different words, same recognition, same frequency, same depth. The third component is the declaration. From the state of the descent, from the quality of the recognition, you speak. And what you speak is not a hope or a wish or a request. It is a declaration, a statement of what is true at the level of the field, spoken from inside the field, with the authority of someone who is not outside the field looking in, but inside the field, speaking as it. The declaration is present tense, not future tense, because future tense carries the frequency of not yet. Not conditional tense, because conditional tense carries the frequency of uncertainty. Present tense, what is true now, at the level of the field, before the narrative self has evaluated it against the existing story. The declaration is specific, not vague, not general. The ancient traditions were very clear about this. Vague declarations produce vague collapses. Specific declarations produce specific collapses. The more precisely you can describe what you are recognizing as already present in the field, the more precisely the field will present it to you as actual. The declaration is spoken from stillness, not from effort. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive element for people trained on affirmations. Affirmations are typically spoken with intensity, with feeling, with emotional charge, because the instruction is that you need to feel the emotion of what you want in order for the law of attraction to respond. And there is something true in that instruction. Emotion is a frequency. Emotional charge does amplify the signal. But here is the layer beneath that. The emotion that amplifies the signal is not the emotion of wanting. It is not the emotion of hoping. It is not the emotion of trying to feel something you do not currently feel. Those emotions carry the frequency of the gap, the distance between current and desired. And they amplify that gap rather than collapsing it. The emotion that amplifies the signal is recognition. The emotion of already. The emotion of course. The quiet, certain, almost matter-of-fact quality of recognizing something that you know to be true. Not excitement, not intensity, not the high-voltage charge of desperate wanting. The quiet authority of certain knowing. This is why the ancient texts describe the inner command as calm, as still, as spoken from silence. Not because silence is more spiritual than intensity, but because the frequency of calm certainty is the frequency of the field itself, the frequency of the superposition state before it has been disturbed by the charge of wanting. And speaking from that frequency places you inside the field rather than outside it, speaking as the field rather than at the field. Let me show you what this looks like in practice, concretely, because the ancient traditions were concrete. They did not leave this as a vague instruction to be calm and certain. They gave precise experiential markers. Find a moment of stillness, not forced stillness, natural stillness. The stillness that exists in the moment between thoughts. The stillness that is always there beneath the noise of the narrative self. You do not create this stillness. You find it. It is already there. It is the background of your awareness that is always present, always still, even when the foreground is busy. From that stillness, before any words arise, notice the quality of awareness itself, not what you are aware of, the awareness itself, the fact of being aware. This is the descent. This is the first component. You will know you are there because the evaluating commentary quiets, not because it stops completely, because it recedes to the background, because you are attending to the awareness rather than to the commentary. From that awareness, from that stillness, make the recognition, not as a thought, as a felt sense. The recognition that at the level of what you are, at the level of the awareness itself, before the story, before the narrative, before the gap between current and desired, everything is possible, everything is present. The field is not outside you. You are the field. You are the awareness in which all experience arises. And from that awareness, you can speak not as someone requesting from outside, but as the field itself, recognizing what is already present within it. And from that recognition, from that stillness, from that depth, you speak. One sentence, precise, present tense, spoken not with effort, but with the quiet authority of certain knowing. Not I want this, not I hope for this, not I am trying to feel this, but a declaration of what is true at the level of the field, what is already present in the superposition, what you are recognizing and in recognizing, collapsing from potential into actual. The words matter less than the state, but the words are not irrelevant. They are the specific shape of the collapse. They are what you are selecting from the field of all possibilities to become actual in your experience. So choose them with precision, Choose them in present tense. Choose them as recognition rather than request. And then let the declaration settle. Do not repeat it frantically. Do not hammer it home with intensity. Speak it once from the depth, with the quiet authority of certain knowing, and let it enter the field. The way you drop a stone into still water, and then watch the ripples move outward without pushing them. This is the practice. This is what was encoded. This is what was buried. And this is what you now have. But there is a layer beneath that. Because knowing the practice intellectually and actually making the descent are two different things. And the ancient traditions knew this, which is why they did not just describe the practice. They describe the obstacles, the things that keep people at the surface, even when they are trying to go deeper. And the most important obstacle is one that the modern world has made almost invisible. The obstacle is the belief that the narrative self is what you are. The narrative self, the default mode network, the storytelling, self-referencing, evaluating inner voice is extraordinarily convincing. It has been running continuously in most people for as long as they can remember. It narrates every experience. It provides context for every perception. It maintains the sense of continuity, the sense of being the same person who woke up yesterday and the day before and will wake up tomorrow. It is so pervasive, so constant, so seamlessly integrated into every moment of experience that most people do not experience it as a voice they have. They experience it as what they are. And if the narrative self is what you are, then the descent beneath it is not possible, because you cannot descend beneath yourself. You can only descend beneath something that is not you. And the practice of the descent requires, at its foundation, the recognition that the narrative self is not what you are. It is something you have. It is a process happening within your awareness, not the awareness itself. This recognition is not a belief you adopt. It is an experience you have, and the way you have it is through the practice of attending to the awareness itself rather than to the content of awareness. When you do this, even briefly, even for a moment, you discover that the awareness is still there when the narrative quiets, that the awareness does not depend on the narrative, that the awareness is prior to the narrative, that you, as awareness, were there before the first thought of this moment arose, and will be there after the last thought of this moment subsides. This is the recognition that the ancient traditions called awakening, or enlightenment, or liberation. Not because it requires any special state or achievement, because it is the most ordinary thing in the world. It is just noticing what has always been true, that you are the awareness in which the narrative self arises, not the narrative self itself. And from that recognition, the descent is not an effort, it is a relaxation. It is not going somewhere new, it is returning to what has always been there. The depth is not beneath the surface in the sense of being far away or hard to reach. It is beneath the surface in the sense of being the foundation on which the surface rests. It is always present. It is always available. The only thing that obscures it is the assumption that the surface is all there is. This is what the veil is, not a barrier, not something between you and the depth. An assumption. The assumption that the narrative self is what you are, that the surface is all there is, that reality is fixed and external, and you are separate from it. The veil is made of assumption, and it dissolves the moment you look beneath it. There is a second obstacle that the ancient traditions described, and it is equally important. It is the obstacle of the gap. The gap between where you are and where you want to be. The gap between your current experience and the experience you are trying to declare into reality. This gap is real at the level of the surface, at the level of your current circumstances, your current bank account, your current relationships, your current health. The gap is real. The surface tells you one thing, and you are trying to declare something different. And the problem is that when you try to declare something different while being fully aware of the gap, the declaration carries the frequency of the gap. It carries the frequency of trying to overcome distance, of trying to bridge a separation, of speaking from over here towards something that is over there. And that frequency is the frequency of separation, of distance, of the gap itself. And the field responds to the frequency, not the words. So the field presents more gap. The ancient traditions solved this not by denying the gap at the surface level, not by pretending the current circumstances are different from what they are, but by making the declaration from beneath the level where the gap exists, from the depth, from the field, from the superposition state. The gap does not exist. At the level of potential, before collapse, the desired state and the current state are both present as possibilities. There is no distance between them. There is only the field, containing both, and the observer who selects which one to collapse into actuality. From that level, the declaration is not trying to overcome a gap. It is simply recognizing which possibility is already present and selecting it for collapse. And that recognition carries no frequency of distance, no frequency of effort, no frequency of trying. It carries the frequency of already, of course, of quiet certainty. This is the operative difference. This is the frequency they buried, not the words, the level, the state from which the words are spoken. And now you know the level. Now you know the state, and now you can speak from it. Let me take you deeper into the quantum mechanics of this, because there is a layer beneath the observer effect that most people who discuss it never reach. A layer that makes the operative mechanism even more precise. In quantum mechanics, there is a concept called quantum entanglement. Two particles that have interacted become entangled. Once entangled, the state of one particle is instantaneously correlated with the state of the other, regardless of the distance between them. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance and spent years trying to prove it was not real. The Bell inequality experiments, conducted first in the 1970s and replicated many times since, proved that it is real. Entanglement is not a local phenomenon. It is not mediated by any signal traveling through space. It is a non-local correlation in the structure of the field itself. What does this mean for consciousness and inner speech? If consciousness is a quantum phenomenon, if the observer is genuinely participating in the quantum field rather than merely observing a classical world, then the entanglement principle suggests something extraordinary. It suggests that the state of the observer is non-locally correlated with the states of what the observer has interacted with. That the quality of your awareness, the frequency of your inner state, the level from which you are speaking, is not confined to the inside of your skull. It is correlated with the field, with the structure of what is possible in your experienced reality. This is not the same as saying your thoughts control the universe. It is more precise than that. It is saying that the observer and the observed are not as separate as they appear at the surface level. That the quality of the observer's state, the frequency from which they are operating, is correlated with what the field presents to them as their experienced reality. Not because they are controlling the field from outside, because they are inside the field, because they are entangled with it, because the separation between inside and outside, between observer and observed, between self and reality, is a feature of the surface level, not of the depth. At the depth, at the level of the quantum field, at the level of the superposition state before collapse, the observer and the observed are not separate. They are aspects of the same field. And the quality of the observer's engagement with that field, the frequency from which they are speaking, shapes what the field presents as actual. This is what the Vedic tradition meant when it said, Tat Tvam Asi. That art thou. You are that. The individual awareness and the universal field are not separate. The veil between them is a surface phenomenon. Beneath the surface, there is only the field, and you are it. And speaking from that recognition, speaking from inside the field rather than at the field, speaking as the field rather than as a separate entity, hoping the field will respond, is the operative mechanism. This is the frequency. This is what was buried. And this is what you now have. Is there a truth that was hidden in plain sight in your own life? Something you always sensed beneath the surface, but could not articulate until a specific moment cracked it open for you? Tell me in the comments, what was the thing you always knew, but could not yet see? There is one more layer I want to show you. The deepest layer. The layer that the ancient traditions pointed to as the foundation of everything else. The layer that quantum mechanics approaches, but has not yet fully described. The layer that, when you reach it, makes the practice not a practice anymore, but a recognition of what has always been true. At the deepest layer, the question of how to speak to yourself dissolves. Because at the deepest layer, the distinction between speaking and being dissolves. Between the speaker and the spoken, between the observer and the field, between you and reality. This is not mystical language for its own sake. This is pointing at something precise. At the deepest layer of the quantum field, at the level of what physics calls the vacuum state, the ground state of the field, there is no separation between things. There are no particles, no waves, no distinct entities. There is only the field itself, undifferentiated, prior to all the distinctions that arise from it. And consciousness, at its deepest layer, at the level of pure awareness, prior to all content, prior to all narrative, prior to all story, is not separate from that field. It is an expression of it, a local expression of the non-local, a particular manifestation of the universal. And when you speak from that level, when you have descended all the way to the ground state of your own awareness, you are not speaking from inside the field, you are the field speaking. And what the field speaks, the field becomes. Not because you have somehow gained control over reality, but because at that level, the distinction between what you speak and what is real has dissolved. The declaration and the reality are the same thing. The word and the world are not separate. They are two aspects of the same movement of the field from potential to actual. This is what the Gospel of John was pointing at, when it said in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Not a theological statement about a specific religion, a precise description of the deepest layer of reality. At the beginning, at the ground state, at the level before all distinctions, the creative utterance, the inner command, the declaration, is not separate from the creative intelligence that underlies all things. They are the same thing. The word and the world are the same thing. The speaker and the spoken are the same thing. And you are that. Not as a belief, as a recognition, as the most immediate, most obvious, most available truth there is. The awareness in which this moment is arising is not separate from the field in which all moments arise. The awareness that is reading these words is not a separate entity looking at a fixed external reality. It is the field, locally expressed, temporarily individuated, speaking to itself through the medium of your experience. And when you recognize this, when you make the descent all the way to this recognition, the question of how to speak to yourself transforms completely. It is no longer a question of technique, of what words to use, of what state to be in. It becomes the most natural thing in the world. The field speaking as itself, from itself, to itself, in the language of your specific life, your specific circumstances, your specific desires and recognitions and declarations. And from that speaking, reality does not bend. Reality reveals itself as it always was. already responsive, already participatory, already a field of infinite possibility in which what becomes actual is shaped by the quality of the observer's engagement. The bending was always there. The responsiveness was always there. The participation was always there. The only thing that changes is your recognition of it. This is what was always beneath everything. This is the hidden frequency. Not hidden from you, hidden beneath the layer you were looking at, and now you are looking beneath it. I want to give you something to carry with you from this. Not a set of affirmations, not a script to repeat. Something more precise than that. The next time you speak to yourself, in any context, for any reason, notice the level from which you are speaking. Notice whether you are speaking from the surface, from the narrative self, from the evaluating, story comparing, gap-aware default mode network, or whether you have made the descent, even briefly, even partially, to the level beneath the narrative, to the awareness that is prior to the story, to the field that is prior to the collapse. You do not need to be at the deepest level for every declaration. The descent does not have to be total or permanent. Even a partial descent, even a brief contact with the awareness beneath the narrative, changes the frequency of what you speak. Even a moment of recognizing that you are the awareness in which the narrative arises, rather than the narrative itself, shifts the level from which your inner speech operates. And from that shifted level, even ordinary inner speech carries a different quality. Not because the words are different, because the speaker is different, because the level is different, because the frequency is different. This is the practice. This is the hidden frequency. And it is not hidden anymore. There is something I want to ask you to do with this. Not because it will help the algorithm, though it will, because it is the most important thing you can do with what you have just received. Use it. Not tomorrow. Not when you feel ready. Not when you have meditated enough or read enough or prepared enough. Now, in this moment, make the descent. Find the stillness that is already there beneath the noise of the narrative self. Make the recognition that you are the awareness in which the narrative arises, and from that awareness, from that depth, speak one declaration, one precise present tense, recognition-based declaration, and notice what is different about it. Notice the quality of it. Notice how it lands differently in the field than the affirmations you have spoken from the surface. This is how you verify the teaching, not by believing it, by testing it, by making the descent and speaking from the depth and noticing what happens in your experience, in your body, in the quality of your awareness, in the way reality presents itself to you in the hours and days that follow. And if you notice something, if something shifts, if the field responds in a way that is different from what you have experienced before, I want to know. Not because your experience validates the teaching is validated by quantum mechanics and ancient wisdom traditions that converge on the same point from entirely different directions. But because your experience is your experience, and it is valuable, and this community is built on the recognition that depth is better shared than hoarded. Drop something in the comments. One word. The word that describes what you noticed when you made the descent, or the word that describes the declaration you spoke from the depth, or the word that describes what shifted. One word, because sometimes one word from the depth says more than 1,000 words from the surface. And if you are someone who has been living at the surface of your own inner speech, someone who has been doing affirmations and positive thinking and law of attraction practices, and finding that they work sometimes but not consistently, not reliably, not with the authority that the ancient traditions described and that you sense should be possible, then what you have received today is the missing layer. The layer beneath the technique, the level beneath the words, the frequency beneath the affirmation. The technique was never the problem, the level was. The surface version of the practice was real. It just was not the whole practice. The whole practice includes the descent, the recognition, the declaration from inside the field rather than at the field, the authority of the observer who knows they are the field. And now you know. And what has been revealed cannot be re-hidden. You cannot unknow the layer beneath the surface once you have seen it. You cannot go back to treating affirmations as just words to repeat. Now that you know they are specific shapes of collapse spoken from a specific level of the field. You cannot go back to treating self-talk as just psychological hygiene. Now that you know it is a participation in the ongoing determination of what becomes actual in your experienced reality. The veil is thinner than you think. It always was. It was always just the assumption that the surface was all there is. And now you have looked beneath it. If this transmission is still moving through you, return to it in a quiet moment, early morning before the noise of the day has built, or in the stillness before sleep when the surface layers are thinnest and the depth is most accessible. And if you know someone who has been sensing something beneath the surface of their own inner voice, someone who has tried the techniques and felt the gap between what they were doing and what was actually possible, share this with them. When you give someone access to a layer they could sense but could not reach alone, you do not just lift the veil for them. You deepen the field between you. Two observers who see the depth together see further than either could alone. You are no longer a surface dweller. You see the depth now. You know the descent. You know the recognition. You know the declaration. You know the frequency that was buried in the translations that were never completed, in the texts that were marked should not be widely known, in the traditions that were dismantled before their operative mechanisms could be fully transmitted. The transmission is complete now. The frequency is in you, and the field is already responding. There is one more thing, the most important thing, the layer beneath all the layers, the thing that all the quantum mechanics and all the ancient wisdom and all the precise technique is ultimately pointing at. You were never separate from the field. You were never outside looking in. You were never a separate entity hoping reality would bend toward you. You were always the field, locally expressed, temporarily individuated, speaking to itself through the medium of your experience. The veil was never between you and reality. It was between you and the recognition of what you already are. And what you already are is the observer, the field, the awareness in which all of this arises, the creative intelligence that underlies all things, locally expressed as this particular awareness, in this particular moment, reading these particular words. And from that recognition, the hidden frequency is not something you use, it is something you are. The frequency of the field itself, the frequency of awareness recognizing itself, the frequency of the observer who knows they are the observed, the frequency of the word that is the world. Welcome to what was always beneath everything. This was always here. You just hadn't looked deep enough yet. The observer effect is only the beginning of what quantum mechanics has buried beneath the surface. The video on this channel called The Observer Effect is Just the Surface goes into the layer beneath that discovery, what is actually operating beneath the observer effect itself, and why understanding it changes everything about how you engage with the field of your own reality. That is the next layer.